On the world map, Mozambique looks like a forgotten sliver of the globe. A long ribbon of coastline along the Indian Ocean, once a Portuguese colony, today a developing state with ambitions whose scale routinely outpaces its fiscal capacity. But for global power brokers, Mozambique has never been an afterthought. It has been a gateway to Southeast Africa, a gateway to maritime corridors, a gateway to gas, coal, graphite, and critical minerals. A gateway to the emerging geopolitics of the Indian Ocean, where trade routes are no longer merely commercial arteries, but strategic terrain, and where connectivity increasingly doubles as leverage. When China moved into this space, it did not arrive with tanks or flags. It arrived with balance sheets, infrastructure contracts, and development finance. It arrived speaking the language of South-South cooperation, but it also brought a distinct strategic imagination. Not simply building roads and ports, but shaping the architecture of supply chains, deciding where value flows, where choke points form, and who ultimately controls the nodes that matter. For Mozambique, this felt like a hinge moment. After years of isolation, fragility, and institutional strain, a partner appeared willing to finance the visible skeleton of modernity. Roads, ports, bridges, power plants. A partner that did not place governance reform at the center of every conversation. A partner that did not ask relentless questions about democracy, human rights, procurement transparency, or the fine print of institutional accountability. This was not a romantic story of development, it was a transaction. And it is from this transaction that a new chapter in East Africa's political economy begins. One in which infrastructure becomes diplomacy, credit becomes strategy, and the line between economic development and geopolitical alignment grows increasingly thin. China's engagement with Mozambique did not begin with altruism. It began with a resource map. Mozambique possesses some of the largest natural gas reserves in the region, vast coal deposits in Tete Province, expanding graphite output, and growing extraction of minerals that feed global battery supply chains. It also holds a strategic position on the Indian Ocean. For Beijing, this configuration translates into a single strategic proposition: resource security and logistical leverage. China does not invest in Africa randomly. Its projects tend to be synchronized with a wider vision of global trade architecture, an approach that links finance, construction, procurement, shipping lanes, and industrial policy into one coherent system. Mozambique fits that system unusually well. Ports such as Maputo, Beira, and Nacala function as natural gateways into southern Africa's interior. For China, that means alternative transport corridors that can bypass Western-dominated logistics ecosystems, Western port operators, and Western standards of commercial governance that sometimes slow or condition market entry. The second dimension is politics. Mozambique is a state that has struggled for years with instability, corruption, and weak institutions. For many Western investors, these factors function as a red flag. For China, they can function as an opening, because Beijing's model does not depend on deep political reform as a prerequisite for infrastructure delivery. What it requires is central government consent, signed memoranda, and access to land and project sites. The rest is operational. Infrastructure projects under this model move quickly, often executed by large Chinese construction conglomerates using Chinese materials, Chinese machinery, Chinese subcontractors, and frequently Chinese managerial labor. The result is a distinctive political economy of implementation. Capital formally enters Mozambique, but much of it circulates through a Chinese corporate ecosystem, returning to Chinese suppliers, Chinese engineering firms, Chinese logistics providers, and Chinese financiers. In that sense, investment becomes a closed loop. Money moves, but it moves in a way that preserves Chinese control over the value chain. The third dimension is long-term strategy. China does not view Mozambique as a one-off investment destination. It treats the country as part of a broader Indian Ocean framework, a region increasingly emerging as one of the central theaters of 21st century commercial competition. In this arena, ports are not merely commercial assets. They are strategic infrastructure. Transport corridors are not merely domestic development projects. They are geopolitical connectors. Every road, port, and railway line is not only a development project. It is a physical imprint of influence, durable, embedded, and difficult to reverse. And this is where tensions begin. Because the more infrastructure expands, the deeper financial dependency can become. Loans must be serviced, contracts must be renewed, maintenance cycles must be funded, spare parts must be sourced, software must be updated, training must be provided. Political decisions increasingly begin to take shape under the pressure of fiscal obligations, under the quiet logic of we cannot afford to rupture this relationship. Mozambique has not become a colony, but it has become part of a network of structural dependence, woven not through territorial conquest, but through finance, construction, and logistical integration. China's expansion in Mozambique does not primarily move through classic private equity investment or Western-style development grants. Its central instrument is infrastructure lending tied to execution. On the surface, it resembles development assistance. In practice, it operates as a mechanism for strategic binding, linking a state's economic future to the systems of an external partner. The pattern is consistent and repeatable. Mozambique's government announces the need for a port, a highway, a bridge, or a power plant. Chinese state banks offer financing. The condition is straightforward. A Chinese consortium builds the project using Chinese equipment, Chinese materials, and often Chinese labor. Capital formally enters Mozambique, but in operational reality it circulates within China's industrial system, reinforcing Chinese corporate strength and securing Chinese market access. For Maputo, this provides rapid infrastructure without the long procedural filters associated with Western financial institutions. For Beijing, it provides guaranteed contracts, footholds in strategic sectors, and a long-term political lever. And crucially, this is not a one-time lending model. It is a model of continuity. One investment generates the next. A port upgrade requires new highways require bridges require maintenance requires technical services generate new contracts. Each phase opens space for additional loans and further entanglement. The result is a structure of dependence that does not need to look formally colonial in order to function as a system of pressure. Once debt servicing begins to weigh on public budgets, governments face a narrowing set of choices: renegotiate with China, accept new terms, or risk fiscal instability. Under such conditions, political autonomy becomes constrained, not through overt coercion, but through the mathematics of obligation. Mozambique has already experienced how dangerous opaque debt accumulation can be. The so-called hidden debt scandal, linked to undisclosed state-backed guarantees issued without parliamentary approval, shattered confidence among international financial institutions and pushed the country toward a debt crisis. That episode created a vacuum, and vacuums in political economy rarely remain empty. While Western financing slowed or tightened, Beijing offered an alternative: fewer political conditions, faster approvals, greater flexibility. For a government under budgetary and social pressure, this flexibility was not a theoretical advantage. It was a pragmatic lifeline. But flexibility comes with a price. Infrastructure loans are often collateralized, explicitly or implicitly, against future revenue streams, export receipts, port fees, concession rights, or strategic access arrangements. In effect, parts of the country's economic future can be mortgaged to fund present-day construction. This is how debt becomes a tool of influence, not through explicit diktat, but through structural entanglement. The more projects Chinese firms execute, the harder it becomes to exit the system without paying a steep financial and operational cost. Infrastructure grows, and with it grows long-term financial dependence, technological dependence, and managerial dependence. This is why the China-Mozambique relationship cannot be reduced to a simple narrative of development assistance. It is part of a broader model Beijing applies across the global South. a model in which infrastructure investment is simultaneously political investment. But credit is only one dimension of this equation. The second, and equally consequential dimension, is what Mozambique holds under its soil and offshore waters. The resources that give this relationship its strategic weight. That is the pivot point. Because China's relationship with Mozambique is not an abstract diplomatic chess match. It materializes in concrete, asphalt, and steel. It is visible on the national map. It is visible in ports, roads, stadiums, power stations, and government districts. For Beijing, infrastructure is the purest form of influence. It is durable. It cannot be easily undone. It persists for decades. Over the past decade and a half, China has become one of Mozambique's largest contractors for public projects, not primarily through equity ownership, but through bundled financing execution packages that knit together capital and construction. The first symbols of this presence are maritime. Maputo Port, the country's primary commercial gateway, has undergone partial expansion and modernization with the participation of Chinese engineering firms. Officially, the objective was improving throughput and capacity. In operational reality, the logic was to create a smoother export node for commodities and industrial goods, aligned with China's wider Indian Ocean posture. The second strategic layer was the expansion of transport corridors linking the interior to the coast. Roads and logistics lines connecting extraction zones to ports form the backbone of a resource economy. Chinese consortiums built long segments of highways and bridges financed through state-linked credit. These were not urban mobility projects designed for daily city traffic. These were export corridors built to move bulk. The third segment was energy infrastructure. China participated in upgrades to transmission systems, construction of substations, and projects linked to hydropower and broader electrification. Public messaging emphasized national electrification. The operational logic prioritized stable energy supply for industrial zones, ports, and extraction operations. The fourth category was prestige infrastructure. Stadiums, administrative buildings, conference centers, and government complexes in Maputo were implemented by Chinese firms as part of an approach often described as infrastructure diplomacy. Such assets do not necessarily generate direct commercial returns, but they generate political goodwill, especially among elites, and they embed China's visibility in public space. The fifth pillar was housing and urban development. Chinese companies delivered entire residential projects, often aimed at segments of the middle class or public sector employees. In practice, this meant exporting Chinese construction methods, prefabrication systems, and urban planning templates, along with their supply chains. The sixth strategic segment was industrial infrastructure, industrial parks, special economic zones, and logistics platforms designed to attract or support foreign investors. China did not merely build isolated structures, it built operational ecosystems, systems of movement, storage, connection, and control. But the decisive factor is not the list of projects, it is the terms. Most of these projects were financed through loan-for-contract frameworks. The money originated from Chinese state banks. Implementation went to Chinese construction conglomerates. Materials, machinery, and often management came from China. Mozambique gained speed. China gained end-to-end control over the value chain. Many contracts also included clauses related to long-term servicing, maintenance, and access to future modernization, creating a closed-loop effect. Once a project is built, it generates new contracts to maintain and upgrade it, often with the same partner. In this way, infrastructure ceased to be a neutral public good. It became part of a long-term architecture of influence. Mozambique gained roads, ports, and public buildings, but it also acquired financial obligations, technological dependence, and operational entanglement. This influence has its physical icons, projects that became symbols of a new era. The first case is the Maputo-Katembe Bridge. It is the most recognizable emblem of China's presence in the country. A landmark structure, one of the longest suspension bridges on the continent, connecting the capital to the southern coastline and compressing travel time from hours to minutes. Officially, it was a development project, mobility, tourism, integration. Strategically, it was a connector of logistics and trade corridors. It was financed largely through Chinese state credit and executed by a Chinese engineering consortium, an archetypal loan for contract arrangement. Capital originated in China, and a substantial portion returned to Chinese firms through equipment, materials, labor, and engineering services. The bridge's significance extends beyond local commuting. It strengthens export logistics toward southern Africa and embeds Mozambique more tightly into an Indian Ocean trade system. It is, in short, a symbol of a new era. Large-scale infrastructure financed by China, highly visible, politically resonant, and strategically consequential. The second case is the Zimpito National Stadium. This project was not economically necessary, it was politically useful. Built by Chinese firms and funded through Chinese support mechanisms, it represents the soft dimension of infrastructure influence. It does not generate export revenue, it generates legitimacy, visibility, and elite goodwill. Such projects work at the level of public narrative and political symbolism. They are difficult to contest domestically because they appear as gifts of modernity. It is a classic element of infrastructure diplomacy. Finance prestige assets, earn political capital, secure long-term access. The third case is the Moamba Major Dam. Here, symbolism ends and hard energy begins. The dam is a strategically consequential investment for the energy system of southern Mozambique. Public narratives emphasize energy security and development. Operationally, such projects stabilize power supply for industrial corridors and logistics nodes. Financing again came through Chinese credit channels and implementation through Chinese engineering ecosystems. A hydropower plant is not merely an asset. It is a long-term technological dependency, maintenance, upgrades, parts, expertise. It binds the country to its technology provider for decades. After bridges, stadiums, and dams comes the layer that determines what Mozambique sells to the world and how efficiently it moves it. Here, the story stops being symbolic and becomes commercial. The fourth case is Beira Port. Beira is one of the most important logistics hubs in central Mozambique and the broader region. It serves not only Mozambique but also landlocked neighbors such as Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Malawi. Chinese firms have participated in modernization, terminal upgrades, dredging, logistics expansion. Officially, this is about increased capacity. Strategically, it transforms Beira into a regional export platform. For Beijing, Beira is a point of access to inland resources. For Mozambique, it is a port increasingly integrated into an export-oriented logic rather than local commercial circulation. It is infrastructure that looks like development, but it reorients economic flow. The fifth case is the Nacala Corridor. This is one of the region's most strategic transport projects, linking northern provinces to the deep water port of Nacala on the Indian Ocean. It is not just rail. It is a full export artery, rail infrastructure, logistics support, port capacity. Chinese consortiums have been involved in port-related expansion and modernization along the corridor. For Beijing, Nacala offers a direct route for mineral and coal exports, and potentially gas-related logistics from the north. It fits a familiar Chinese logic, from extraction to ship with minimal friction, minimal intermediaries, and maximum logistical control. The sixth case is Maputo's Ring Road, less spectacular than bridges, but more consequential day-to-day. Built by Chinese firms with development credit support, it reduces urban congestion and creates a dedicated backbone for freight movement toward ports and industrial zones. It is infrastructure designed not for prestige, but for logistics. It lowers transport costs, shortens time, and strengthens Maputo as a functional trade node in a regional system increasingly intertwined with Chinese trade routes. These are not random investments. Together, they form a system, a coordinated network of influence points that create a physical skeleton of China's presence in Mozambique. And the strategic question emerges naturally: why build this network at all? The answer leads directly to resources. Under Mozambique's northern provinces, offshore waters, and interior regions lies a resource combination that carries geopolitical weight in the 21st century, comparable to oil in the Middle East. Natural gas, coking coal, graphite, and industrial minerals form a package tailored to China's industrial needs. The largest magnet is offshore natural gas in the Rovuma Basin, near Cabo Delgado. Among the biggest discoveries on the continent, it offers the potential for long-term LNG supply diversification, reducing China's exposure to volatile Middle Eastern supply lines, and strengthening its energy security posture. In a world where energy security is treated as state strategy, such reserves are not just business, they are geopolitical instruments. Parallel to this is coal in Tete. While global discourse speaks of phasing out coal, heavy industry continues to demand it, especially for steel production. For China, still the world's largest steel producer, access to stable, relatively low-cost coal remains a strategic industrial concern. And then there is graphite, central to lithium-ion batteries, and therefore to electric vehicles and grid-scale storage. Here, the loop closes. China builds battery factories. China produces electric vehicles. China needs graphite. Mozambique can supply it. This is why the infrastructure described earlier matters. Ports are not merely ports. They are export terminals. Roads are not merely roads. They are extraction corridors. Power plants are not merely power plants. They stabilize industrial output. The system is coherent. It is a political economy built around a resource spine. Mozambique becomes a supplier of raw inputs rather than a center of high-value processing. The commodity flows outward. The value added is captured elsewhere. For Beijing, this is efficient. It secures inputs without requiring the full transfer of high-value industrial capacity. For Mozambique, the arrangement is ambivalent. Budget revenue, some jobs, and visible infrastructure, alongside a reinforced dependence on commodity export and external systems of finance and technology. But the model has a weak point. The region that hosts the largest gas projects has also become one of the country's most unstable zones. Northern Mozambique, especially Cabo Delgado, has faced violence, armed mobilization, and conflict dynamics linked to control over resources. And this is where the next chapter begins. Because once LNG enters the equation, infrastructure is no longer sufficient. Protection of interests becomes part of the strategy. Northern Mozambique spent years as a peripheral region: weak infrastructure, high poverty, deep marginalization, and limited state presence. When massive gas reserves were discovered, the region suddenly became one of the most geopolitically valuable points in East Africa. And conflict followed. Armed groups began attacking villages, towns, and infrastructure. The violence was not random. It clustered around areas connected to LNG projects, logistics routes, and industrial support zones. This is a familiar pattern. Where billions of dollars converge, contestation intensifies. For Mozambique's government, it was an economic and political shock. Gas was supposed to anchor future state revenue. Instead, instability triggered investment risk, evacuations, and operational disruptions. For China, it was a warning signal. Beijing has long promoted a model of economic expansion without direct military entanglement. Infrastructure instead of bases, finance instead of intervention. Cabo Delgado revealed the limits of that approach. When resource projects and logistics nodes worth billions are at risk, security stops being a local problem. It becomes strategic calculus. China officially avoided direct military involvement. Instead, it leaned into security diplomacy, cooperation with the Mozambican government, training support, surveillance technology transfer, monitoring systems, and protection frameworks for critical infrastructure. This represents a different form of presence, Not bases on the ground, but digital and logistical tools of control, cameras, monitoring, drones, movement tracking, perimeter security systems. A regional element also emerged. Stabilization efforts involved actors from southern Africa, including Rwanda, and regional security arrangements, creating a new security architecture around LNG projects. For Beijing, this is operationally convenient. The military burden is carried by regional partners, while China maintains its position as investor and provider of security-related technology, without absorbing the political costs of intervention. But the Cabo Delgado conflict exposed more than tactical risk. It exposed the structural tension between megaprojects and local communities. Many residents saw little benefit from the gas boom. Instead, they saw displacement, restricted access to land, and rising living costs. These dynamics created fertile ground for anger, radicalization, and conflict economies. Mozambique's resource jackpot became a driver of instability,